Welcome to the last installment of our study of desire, Why It Matters, by Traleg Kyabgon Rinpoche. Tomorrow actually is, in the Buddhist calendar, we celebrate the day that the Buddha first taught. And let me just check, by the way, if the sound is okay. Is the sound all right? Can you hear me? Sound? Mm-hmm. Yes, okay, good. All right, good. So so tomorrow is what we in Tibetan call Chungkur Duchen, which means the celebration of when the Buddha first turned the wheel of the Dharma, and it's also the anniversary of Traleg Kyabgon Rinpoche's passing, which was in 2012. So tomorrow is actually a very special day then in the life of for the students of Traleg Kyabgon Rinpoche. So if you have the opportunity, then please spend some time reflecting on the greatness of Traleg Rinpoche. Siddhartha's intent will be doing some practices also. I think those of you who are on the mailing list, you would already know about this. Yeah? Good. So we're in the chapter then, which is called Enrichment Through Positive Emotion. Now, what's an important part really here is that as we're dealing with desire, of course, we very often have the impression through Vajrayana method that yes, desire is something that we would want to put into practice. And that's true. At all levels of the Buddhist path, we actually operate with the value of desire. But we should never think that desire then is just the desire as we ordinarily perceive of it, which is wishing to be gratified according to our own premise, because our own premise generally is driven by confusion and this self-centered agenda that continually drives our suffering. So that's where desire is not particularly helpful. On the other hand, the inspiration of wanting and wishing to achieve something that is different from what we have right now is indicative of our Buddha nature. And so putting desire within the context of the path to enlightenment is something that's extremely valuable. So we from that point of view, then we're very clear that the desire has great value, and also we operate with the sense that emotions they're not just first of all emotions in the sense of, oh yeah, well, we have these feelings and we can be free of them, and as such then we don't really need to change. We do need to change. We need to replace our negative impulses that are driven by our habitual confusion with a whole different realm of emotions, which are the positive emotions, because we are emotional beings. We are conventionally emotionally driven. Of course, yes, great yogis are untouched by any kind of ordinary phenomena, but at the same time then their wisdom naturally, as we'll be discussing actually, their wisdom naturally comes with an array of enlightened qualities. So the experience of an enlightened yogi is one of experiencing somebody that is absolutely delightful. But yes, we could say, yes, such a great yogi, what's so wonderful about them, their sort of bliss is unconditional. But for the time being, not exactly abiding with this within this unconditional experience of wisdom, then we have to make do with what we are. We can't really operate with what we might be one day, or sort of have some vague understanding of how we could transform emotions and so on. We have to be very real in terms of what we actually experience, which is we have likes and dislikes, and we are emotional beings. The point here in this chapter is that the emotions that we have render our lives tremendously valuable. So emotions, and especially working with our emotions, is something that heightens our life. So Traleg Kyabgon makes the point then that whatever we're going through, then we have a much more intense experience when we have emotions. And so we're not just aiming with the Buddhist path to just be emotion-free or emotionally flatliners. We want to cultivate all the various aspects of positive emotions like we've been looking at here. So clearly we're not talking about in the Buddhist path of stamping out emotions, being unemotional, even the notion of detachment and renunciation and so forth doesn't mean that we will be unemotional. And we should be emotional. We should have positive emotions. Because sometimes the language of the language can be confusing. And so, for example, we'll sometimes refer to kleshas as emotions, and just universally refer to emotions as being synonymous with kleshas. Here, we're talking about different kinds of emotions which have really to do with the positive, which are positive in the sense of not being owned by ego, not being owned by a self-centered agenda. Traleg Kyabgon says, Buddhism teaches the importance of leading a life of equanimity, serenity, and peace. But that ideal may be misinterpreted. We may actually devalue emotions, as if emotions set off imbalances and disturbances. There is no contradiction between leading a life of equanimity, serenity, and peace and finding fulfillment, but based on our emotional experiences. This is where great richness can be found. So again, we could very well work with emotions in the sense of them being the causes of our happiness and also the causes of others' happiness, where we find great richness in our life. So we might think that that we could that we could that we could say, oh yeah, well, these kind of positive states of mind, they're sort of out there in some future. We'll get them. They'll just come to us. And somehow, through us doing all sorts of strange, unrelated things. And that's, of course, rather naive assumptions. Um, the issue is not that it's not about presently we have negative emotions and we need them right now. They're very helpful. You can't survive in the world without negative emotions. You have to be tough. And this, of course, is what we've been challenging throughout the entire book. And what is the point is that negative emotions will never ever help us, even for a moment. And not forget about nirvana, it won't help us presently even. So we need these positive emotions. We need to generate positive emotions right here, right now. It's not something we're reserving for something in the future. Like we often hear, this life is not a dress rehearsal. It's not that we're right now sort of expecting something to be different in the future. What we want in the future, we have to create right now. So, and also what we've repeatedly been looking at here is how positive emotions, they have the ability to disempower the negative emotions. And it's the negative emotions, they're not only that they're sort of colorful aspects of ourselves or they are in any way working for us, they're on the contrary, they degrade us. We're less who we would want to be with negative emotions. So understanding then how emotions come about, we see that they come from a confluence or a working together of thoughts, concepts, attitudes, beliefs, and then emotions in the sense of reacting to circumstances, and also the arising of our habitual projections onto the world around us. So it's on the basis of these conditions that we have the present state of mind that we're experiencing. It's never a one-shot deal, the state of mind that we're in. Traleg Kyabgon says, often within our lives, instead of thinking clearly and being emotionally rich, we have convoluted thoughts that give rise to negative emotions. Negative forms of emotion should be understood in terms of our negative thoughts, feelings, attitudes, belief systems, and so forth. So we're very often, it happens that we're just vague. We don't really know why we feel in a particular way, and we need to. We need to know what's going on in our mind, because that's what we're about. That's becoming awake, is beginning to know what's happening in our mind, knowing what's constructive, what's destructive. And so that's where we need to be really clear and be able to work with these conditions. And this is an interesting discussion, actually. Personally, this has been something that sparked a lot of reflection, really. Individualism and relationship are both emphasized in the West. We know that, particularly, modernity is defined in terms of the individualist approach, right? The individualist pursuit, even the hedonistic pursuit, right? The wishing pleasure for oneself. Relationship, of course, this also exists within modern context, also within the sense of social contracts and the general interaction with our world. But comparatively, in the East, in Asia, relationship is emphasized more. Of course, here we're talking about, you could say, more traditional Asian societies, but even today, actually, we still have in Asia this tremendous sense of awareness of the family that is more important than the individual. The community, the larger community, is more important than the individual. And that's where there's a big difference there. The thing is, actually, when we see ourselves situated within a web of relationship, we are more attentive to the others than if we're just self-centered and purely pursuing an individualistic objective. So that's where ego is actually less. We have less self-centering the moment that we're seeing ourselves in this wider context. If we see, if these two, the difference between individualism and relationship, it can be seen as incompatible if we're unwilling to make compromises. If we're saying, well, this is what I want, that's what I want, this is my dream, this is what I want, and we often hear that, then actually the very often that collides with the being aware of others. And we often have this sort of project that, oh, I don't want to be living for others, in the sense of I don't want to feel obliged to others, and I want to have my individual freedom. That's such a Western modern sort of pursuit. It's so present within so many aspects of our cultural discourse, and these two can actually, they actually can be a little bit incompatible. But it's interesting also that where you have this, you see societies where, of course, the relationship is the more important. It also accommodates individualism. So that's where you have yogis that go off and so forth, but they also see themselves very much as connected. Like we looked earlier, those who are monastics, they'll very often be serving the community. And in general, intrinsic to the Mahayana is that you might go off to the mountains, but that's entirely because you just want to be able to better serve the larger community of all sentient beings. And also, and this is traditional societies in Asia, but also pre-modernity, more accommodations of really the original. Also in the West, actually in old days, you had more accommodation of just originals and strangers, the village lunatic, and so forth. Much more tolerant. Actually, somebody like the French French philosopher and social analyst Michel Foucault, he talks a lot about something we call governmentality, where nowadays we live with sort of a built-in sense of how we should be in context with others, in seeing ourselves, and very often imprisoned by that. And that's part of the sort of the modern ethos, is then we want to break out of that kind of self-imprisonment that we have. But nevertheless, it still actually exists despite us being so incredibly individualistic. And that's where it's interesting to see in some of the traditional more relationship-oriented societies, there's plenty of freedom actually, and we see this in the life of the sadhus, the hermits, the yogis, the sort of various kinds of people who wander off and do what they need to do, but then again also with their commitment to the larger community. Then somebody is saying, yes, the one example about the importance of society in East, as I know, the more suicidal country is Japan and Korea. Can be very tricky, this kind of family-driven society. It's true. Thank you very much. That I'm probably giving a little bit of a simplistic rendition here. We're trying to make a point really, which is more about the Mahayana sort of commitment to others, but it's true, and we can see that this kind of approach can be very destructive, indeed. But we can also see how the individualist approach can be very destructive. So of course, either of these two can sort of become rather extreme. In the sort of the self-centered agenda of the modern person, there's a lot of depression also, and it's hard to really identify what would be the causes of more misery, the two styles. But indeed, these extremes, they reflect that we're still in samsara, whether we are in individualistic or relationship-oriented societies, for sure. So, fragmentation and the deluded mind. So we should understand that our mind in its ordinary condition is, again, like we looked, it's a little bit confused, fragmented in the sense we're not quite clear on what's happening. We would say that it's fragmented as many different elements are at work simultaneously, and simplicity eludes us. What's beautiful about the sage is that things are not simple in a simplistic way, but just, and we've also looked at this in the context of studying dependent origination and auspicious coincidence with Chögyam Trungpa. For the sage, very often there's a very clear indication of what needs to be done. Whereas when we're caught up in all our various thoughts and hesitations, considerations, wishes, worries, and so on, then we are overwhelmed by this fragmentation. Traleg Kyabgon says, in Buddhism, this is what is referred to when we speak of deluded mind. Deluded mind is characterized by fragmentation because different elements of the mind are both working together and against each other. Sometimes there's harmony between and among the elements, at other times there is tension. And sometimes they are opposed to each other, which can introduce an intense experience of mental disturbance and pain into one's mental life. That description is how we should understand what is meant by our mental life and our emotional life in Buddhism. So we should be aware that we have this, we might want something, but then we realize that there might be a conflict with something and our wants and the conflict and the consideration of etc. etc. Is what makes up actually, there's nothing might happen on the surface, but at the same time all of this is happening inside ourselves. So that is mental life, but it's also the life of the mental life of fragmentation and suffering. Now there are then, you could say, canvases where this mental life then can be painted on. So we could talk about, there are certain states of mind which don't necessarily have a particular agenda. These are not particular, they're not neither positive nor negative, but they are then influenced on the basis of whatever happens to be happening with us. So these are then sleep, regret, investigation, and analysis. So we'll look at these. So the first, sleep, and as most of us know then, sleep can accommodate both positive and negative states of mind. We have good and bad dreams, and this is determined by experiences that we have during the daytime. We know that. Can also be other circumstances, but generally this is, dreams tend to be reflections of what happens during the day. Regret. I don't know if it's any point I'm reading the Tibetan and the Sanskrit, but sleep is ni, and then Sanskrit nida, and regret is gyöpa, and kurtktia. So, and as you probably suspect, I don't know. I know a little bit of Sanskrit, but not a lot. So some of these, I must say, on that one there, kau kritia, not quite sure how that would be pronounced. Anyway, gyöpa in Tibetan, regret. So they're both positive and negative regrets. So we could obviously say it's a positive regret if we do something that hurts somebody. And then there's a negative regret, which is maybe we sort of we gave somebody who was really needing something, we gave them something very dear to ourselves, and afterwards we regret sort of, I shouldn't have given that person, $20, I shouldn't have given this busker, this beggar too much. And that's kind of negative regret, because initially it was an act of generosity, and then afterwards we regret it, right? So that has to do with our motivation. Then this is also determined by the object of our regret. So whether it's good or bad, we might have been giving weapons to a murderer. We might have funded a charity, and then we regret it afterwards, or we all these kind of things that has to do with the object of our action. And so regret and motivation, the object and the motivation determine whether it's positive or negative. Then we have investigation, tokpa, vitarka, and analysis, chöpa, vichara. So these are, they actually apply when we practice shamatha or resting. In that we're settling the mind, and with the settling of the mind, then we are clear and seeing the object. And so being fully present within our investigation then requires this condition of resting the mind. But there's two aspects here. One is that we understand what's going on around us. So that's sort of a general sense of the situation. And analysis is more when we begin to look at things in particular. So when we practice the shamatha and we practice the 9 levels of shamatha, the 9 ways of resting, then ultimately we go beyond investigation and analysis. We arrive at these samadhi of non-thought. But nevertheless, we need these on the path. So they are definitely positive, depending on the object and the motivation. Now, the thing is, working with the mind like that, calming the mind and so forth, of course, could be dependent on what our motivation is. And so if we are a sniper, we are training ourselves in terms of awareness and calming the mind and so forth, so that we can kill. This obviously is a negative inspiration. If we're doing it on the path of enlightenment, obviously it's positive. By the way, I just did that tonight. I just found it tonight, actually. I was looking on the web and I didn't find it there, but I found it on my computer, which is then a piece that I was talking about last time, written by 2 academics on the importance of ethics and how mindfulness can be hijacked by short-sighted agendas without a further Buddhist understanding. So that's where Buddhism becomes a bit diminished. Actually, one of the authors I found out, I forget his first name, last name is Purser. He's written a book that's called Mindfulness, and which is about then the hijacking of the mindfulness project, which is kind of what we're talking about here. Anyway, investigation and analysis is also essential to Vipassana. It's on the basis of us analyzing initially. When we analyze the solidity, for example, of self and objects and so on, then we use these 2, investigation and analysis. Eventually, also we practice Vipassana, which is beyond that, also which is settling into non-thought. So some people may think that using reasoning or intellectual exercises is anathema to meditation, or to overcoming negative emotions or states of mind. If we have a comprehensive picture of the mind, a detailed map of the mind and how it works, that will help in navigating the mind. Again, this applies to vipassana, where we actually really, in the what we call analytical meditation, we use analysis and investigation a lot. Traleg says, knowing how negative emotions and states of mind arise, how they are encouraged and persist, and what we need to do in order to positively change them is of great benefit. We can learn how positive states of mind can be cultivated and how to work with them to maximize the impact and benefit to our and others' well-being. So this, of course, is what we've been discussing throughout the work, but this is such an important point. So when we are understanding what's happening with the mind and the impact emotions have on us, this is not something that's just theoretical. This is something that we apply immediately. This has not to do with our Buddhist life, sort of separated or compartmentalized apart from our ordinary lived life. This is entirely applicable. So this understanding the mind relates to our daily life. You know, sometimes you would have teachings where the teacher would talk about the emptiness of the mind, or would talk about how we could approach emotions. And then at the end, sometimes people would ask, that's very nice, Rinpoche, but how do we do this in ordinary life? And that reflects this sort of idea that the Buddhist project is something that's apart from our life. Yeah, of course, it's understandable that this misunderstanding happens, but we have to understand that there's never ever a single teaching in Buddhism that is not about enriching our lives. It's not about our daily life. It's not always we can understand it, and sometimes there can be a different difficulty with language and so forth. But we certainly, and this is a point that we need to take with us from this particular study right now, is that all the various teachings on the mind, on emotions, and all things that are about our life, and it's about enriching our life presently, and yes, also in the future, this will be helpful for our journey to enlightenment. So this understanding of ourselves also is about how we interact with the world. So with positive emotions, if we're feeling kindness and so forth, then naturally this also translates into the way that we interact with the world. There's an entirely sort of align these two. So the notion of virtuous intentions is not something about a higher agenda, but it's something that has to do with our immediate experience of who we are and engaging with the world. The very nature, really, of, or rather, these are the conditions that construct who we are. And so this is then what also is changing our character. So we want profound change. That's the premise of engaging with the Buddhist path for sure. We might believe that our mind is entirely tied up with the brain and our body and so forth, and hence it as soon as we die, that's the end of our consciousness. Even so, we could have a very happy life just until then. Then we could be, how do you say, reassured that our life will be happy up to that point if we practice you know, engaging in virtues and changing our character and so forth. And of course, it also applies in the general sense of the Buddhist path, the path to enlightenment, etc., for future lives. So in this context, also, when we talk about the mind, it's not, or rather, when we're talking about transformation and working with our character, it's not just about the mind uniquely. It has actually to do also with our body. It's working with our body. So much of the Dharma practice actually has to do with us relating to our physical form. It's present there in the notion of ethical action, the way that we interact socially. It's also there in the way that we practice yoga. It's also there in the general sort of conduct that we have in terms of elegance around Dharma activity and so forth. So there's both this physical and of course also the mental aspect. This also applies when we have difficult situations where we can see how our character is reflected very well when we have difficult situations when things go wrong. So we could, we can see our true colors manifest then when we have difficult circumstances. So that's where we possibly could see there's room for improvement, but also we could see that when actually we are able to handle difficult circumstances, this is something that has this is greatly helpful. We have more confidence in ourselves. We feel stronger. We feel much more connected really to ourselves and the world around us when we can handle difficult circumstances. This enables us to also assist others and be there for others. Traleg Kyabgon says, it's often stated in Buddhist teachings that we should remain non-attached or dispassionate. These terms do not relate to non-emotionality. What is meant by non-attachment or dispassion, as it is so often translated, references the ability to be non-attached and not motivated by anger, jealousy, spite, resentment, bitterness, and other negative manifestations. It suggests a type of composure that allows us to remain steady without being thrown by turbulent thoughts and emotions. Somebody asked, I'm not sure what I understand what is meant by elements of mind. Could you elaborate a little? Is the reference here to different emotions, for instance? Well, let's say that we have a moment of irritation. So we experience an irritation, but then again, we then understand that this irritation might be brought about by a previous. Previously, prior to this, we were having maybe something else that irritated us, or we were angry, so we're predisposed. Then also we might not have eaten. Then also there might be a loud drilling sound in the room next door, etc., etc. So we can see there's many different elements around us that contribute to a particular state of mind. We also might know that we might, for example, have a pain in the back. So all these circumstances that come together are actually part of the elements that construct what we then presently experience as a moment of consciousness or a moment of mind, a particular emotions. So we understand it's not like there just is this unity in one particular, one emotion. It's constructed by so many circumstances. And that is the beauty of it also, because that's where we can be proactive. Yesterday I was also in another study I was mentioning, just thinking of, let's say, the Dalai Lama, or thinking of the Buddha, or thinking of, Mahatma Gandhi, or thinking just of the value of nonviolence, thinking of the value of patience, remembering some lines by Shantideva, for example. This shifts, yeah? So all these little elements, we might have a shrine. Then as we're experiencing this, then we go to the shrine, we light a stick of incense, make an offering of incense, and pray, may my irritation disperse, may I not harm anybody. All of these work together. So that's what we mean with elements of mind. I guess I do not see circumstances as inherent elements of mind, even if they do serve to trigger reactive habitual behavior. Well, Traleg Kyabgon's point is very much that we understand the mind in terms of different elements, and that's our advantage here. That's what we actually want to take with us from this study and from the study of Abhidharma in general, that our particular state of mind is workable. Let's just take it down to that. It's workable, and it's workable because we can influence it with many different elements, and we can also understand how our present state of mind is created through different elements. There's first, for example, if we look at the skandhas, the sense of I, sense of like, dislike, the sort of the embellishment in terms of how am I doing, in terms of narratives about realities that we're perceiving, and then our particular attitudes on the basis of that prompts actions, etc. Okay, so the presentation of elements is a structural device that allows a certain analysis. Well, it's an analysis that enables us to see that we are constructs. So it's an analysis that, yeah, it's a structural device, but it's more actually an analysis that enables us to see that the structure or the constructs of our emotional state. Yeah, does that make sense? What we're doing here with this study, yeah, they're both outer and inner elements. Yes, circumstances. Yeah, okay, you can see it in both ways, but the bottom line, really, what Traleg wants with this book is very much for us to understand the mind as something that's made up of many different elements. Yeah, that's how we can get at it. This is what we basically in Buddhism also refer to as dependent arising, that everything arises in dependency and in a web of circumstances. Yes, the interdependence of the emotional mind body. Yeah, yeah, good. Good. And try and so look for that. I would say in this study here, look for that. And of course, the beauty of this study is it's not about something that's sort of particularly abstract. It's felt. It's definitely something that, just like we go to a laboratory and we conduct particular experiments, we can also go here and work with our mind. So everything that we're looking at in this study here is something we can go back and we can verify it. We can check what is Traleg Kyabgon saying. And that's what we'd want to do with a study like this. You want to have, you want to have this book sort of well worn, from just looking at it and using it really to see the point that Traleg Kyabgon is making. Because, and this is really basic to the entire Buddhist project. Again, this interdependence. So evaluating benefit. So we can do the right thing, and we can do this based on particular religious motivation. We can also have particular, social contracts, secular rules, and so on. We can also have belief in karma. I remember actually there was a professor in law at Southern Cross University in Lismore, Beach and Go, who actually did a whole study on how Buddhist societies actually how so much of the ethical behavior in these societies was driven by the conviction of the law of karma. So we can have that. So basically, this is what we could say. Even karma also, as much as it's Buddhist, it can also just be something that ends up being you have to do this because then this happens. So that can bring benefit. Adherence to rules can bring benefit, but it helps if we understand why. It's like if we're told that it's eating excess amount of sugar is bad for us. Okay, we believe that, as kids maybe, okay, it's not good for me to eat that much candy. But then as we grow older, we begin to understand actually what sugar does to us and so on. So that's where it's not just that we can't have candy and we shouldn't eat candy, but it's more we understand why it's not good for us. So when we're talking about benefit, let's just be very clear. That simply means what brings happiness. When we're talking about benefit, it's not as if it's that we should abide by a certain thing according to a particular rule that exists somewhere else. It's just basically this is what's, again, coming back to the health. This is what's going to be good for us. Some things are good for us, some things are bad for us. So benefit just here, just like with lifestyle, it's basically what keeps us healthy. So if we apply our insight into the mind, we will be less superficial and less affected by trends. This means that what we're doing comes from a deeper place. It's not that we're just behaving in a particular way because that's how you do it, but we really comes from the heart. We're not just being polite, but it could be that we actually care. And so we're not just abiding by particular social trends and so forth. We're not that easily sort of excited by things that come and go. Traleg says, when we try to cultivate ourselves emotionally, develop good character, and learn to relate to everything and everyone more effectively, this approach is in contrast to following the religious and societal rules somewhat blindly without considering the nuances of the immediate situation and circumstances. So there's a big difference between following these sort of these moral rules, moralistic prescriptions of how we should behave. There's a big difference between that and then actually understanding what actually is happening within situations and coming from a place of understanding the deeper causes of happiness for ourselves and for others. Now, nothing that we experience, this is what we've been talking about, nothing we experience happens in isolation. So whatever we go through, happiness or suffering, previous circumstances and our present reactions impact our happiness and unhappiness. So this we've already been looking at, and also in terms of previous dispositions and so forth. Present circumstances and past circumstances are how we're working with the present situation. This is what impacts our happiness and unhappiness, and this spells out empowerment. This spells out that that we can actually do something about this situation by understanding how the experiences are constructed. So when we have an experience of trauma, it's not just about a single event. It's about many different conditions. We very often relive the past on the basis of how we feel presently. So it's not just that there was a single event, it had a particularly corresponding linear effect right now. It's very much about how we perceive this. So with our reactions, when we do react, we lay down patterns, which then form a continuum. So when we react, we have some impulses and so on, but then we actually react, we verbalize it, we physically act it out. We are imprinting ourselves and constructing ourselves in a particular way. And this is what forms a continuum. The Tibetan word for continuum is then gyun, which means continuity. So they then become part of who we are. We begin to have, we act with irritation or we act with joy. This begins to shape our particular continuum. Traleg says, emotional experience is not just in the head. Emotional experience is written on our face, manifested in behavior and attitude, feelings, how we see other people, how we carry ourselves and conduct our life, and how we behave. For these reasons alone, it's important to address the repertoire, the whole assembly of our mental life in terms of our attitudes, feelings, belief, and our character. So again, what we are has to do with our entire being. It's not just that we have a particular emotion that's just entirely in our thoughts or in our, in our brain or mind or whatever. It's something that translates into our whole body and our actions and so forth. So it's so important that we actually understand these levels of our attitudes and so forth. We should strive for fundamental change, not just finding relief from difficulties. So of course we could find relief in various circumstances, talking with friends and sort of patching over, various kinds of therapies that might sort of have an immediate sort of sense of relief. But we should really work also on the very basic level. And that's where we'd be able to find a profound sense of confidence and freedom. So, of course, there's nobody who's saying it's not good to, I'm just going to turn off the webcam, by the way. Okay, a little bit slow internet. All right. So of course it's okay that we get a break. We might, we're upset. We have a friend we can talk to. That's great. But we ultimately need to be able to handle things ourselves. So we need to be autonomous in that sense. So that's where we come back to this thing that we need to change negative behavioral patterns that degrade our life. So the particular things that of our likes and dislikes then that we become victims of, or we become conditioned by, they actually have an influence on us, and us not being able to handle that, we stand weakly equipped to the circumstances of life. Again, this thing that we're working with, the resistance that we perceive us of as ego, this is not something that is just one solid thing. And this, of course, is where the Buddhist view is very different from how we ordinarily think of things. This so-called ego is made up of, like we talked about before, elements. It's made up of, it's an aggregation. It's body and it's mind. And the aggregation then consists of these 5 skandhas: form, feeling, concept, predispositions, and consciousness. So we looked at that quite extensively. Traleg Kyabgon says, if we understand ourselves in that way, then we're less likely to dissociate the mental from the physical. Further, we also avoid dissociating the physical from our behavior and interaction in terms of our character, disposition, propensities, and things of that kind. So we exist really in terms of not just the mental, but the way that we conduct ourselves is so much tied up with our behavior and our physical embodiment and so forth. So these are not, two different realms. We should understand the sort of holism of our, what we could call mind-body complex, psychophysical aggregation. So that means it's not just, again, about our mind, but about our entire character and our disposition, the way that we have impulses. The more we work with our character, the more we can shape it in terms of something that's positive, then also naturally our impulses will be positive. So this is not about us then doing something moralistic where we say, I should be I should be a good little Buddhist. I should be a good boy, a good girl, and I should just all of a sudden be nice. That's not how it works. We need to actually operate with, working with our selves, with our fixations and graspings that we've looked at here. And through that, we then begin actually to change our perception. We begin to see ourselves in a different way. We begin to see the world in a different way. Once we do that, then we can see, then we have a sense of confidence and flexibility. A little bit what we talk about sometimes, I call it shinjan, that we actually have some sort of capacity to work with ourselves. And when we have that, then we should actually be able to bear things that might be uncomfortable. This is a little bit the test, that we have good practice, we can actually handle difficult circumstances. So that's why we want to moderate then and not be caught up in attachment and aversion. So basically, again, when we work with our mind, then we can work with the various degrees of our likes and dislikes that happen. We are not overwhelmed by dislikes. We're not incredibly attached to what it is that we want, the likes. Traleg Kyabgon says, Buddhism says that we do not have to become virtuous or gain enlightenment overnight. As I have emphasized, even if we feel jealous or angry, we can dismantle the substructures that promote these strong negative forms of emotion. They will then diminish over a period of time. When we deal with the secondary negative emotions in that way, we reduce their strength, and in weakening them, gradually as the suffering is reduced, our happiness will increase. So in one of the earlier chapters, remember, there was what we call the primary negative emotions, the sort of 6 basic primary negative emotions, and then the secondary 20 negative emotions. So when we begin to see how these two work together, then working with the substructures, then we can dismantle the strength of these emotions. And when we do that, we're much more free, we're much happier. As this is some kind of duality here, as I and consider as elements of others' mind, so other is the element of my mind. So interesting, me is gone here. Interesting point. Wow. Okay. All right. Wow. Okay. If we can appreciate how different negative emotions are related, we can work with them. Yeah, that's what that's the point here. Yeah. We have positive and negative emotions that are naturally occurring. So this happens. We're going to have, all of a sudden, spontaneously, we'll have a good feeling, a negative feeling. But we also have these emotions by association, by motivation, by subsequent relations. So in terms of what we're associating, what we're feeling with something that happens, then we begin. It sets off a particular process, maybe association, or motivation in terms of something's happening. What is our agenda? What is it we want in the context of this? And also by the playing out of something happens and then how situations unfold. So in the case of positive emotions, then actually when we begin to develop positive emotions, this also is something that lead us to having ultimate positive emotions. We could understand how negative emotions, that's something that when we are free from them, then we have no more negative emotions. However, and this is an expression of Buddha nature really, when we begin to cultivate positive emotions, it begins to connect with something that goes beyond the ordinary mind, and we have then ultimate positive emotions, like such as we could say the expressions that are unconditional, compassion, and so forth. Traleg says, so a natural virtue like love is not free-floating because that virtue may arise in relation to other virtuous dispositional properties. Virtue may also arise because of a positive motivation, such as wanting to help somebody, and then love arises as a consequence. And it's also then when love then begins to develop, then also love can, when we develop this free from a self-centered agenda, this also begins to develop into something that goes beyond the ordinary self-centering. We should watch out for the trap of moralism in the sense of what we're doing here is not about us imposing something on ourselves. We're never ever suggesting that we should behave in a particular way. We're saying that when the mind is transformed, our behavior spontaneously would transform. But what we're talking about here is not imposing behavior, but rather starting with the cause. So everything that we described here is based on understanding cause and effect. Yeah. So the moment that we talk, for example, about nonviolence, compassion, and so forth, it's not about behaving compassionately. It's about beginning to understand how we can empathize with others, how we begin to see the suffering of others, the need for understanding others, the complexity of our perceptions, and so forth. So there is no absolute should be or predetermined truth. It's not as if there's some book of rules how everything should be. We should see this insight to benefit ourselves and others. So when we're practicing the path and freeing ourselves from negative habits and so forth, this is not about ourselves uniquely. It's about all of us. It's about ourselves and others. So again, what we're studying here is not an isolated spiritual disciple. I think probably it should be discipline. Let's just fix that one. So it's not as if we're doing something that is even particularly Buddhist. It's just that we're working with the conditions, our particular conditions. And this is something that helps us, it helps others as well. So again, this is something that applies in every aspect of the human condition. Traleg says, our task is to understand how the elements of the mind work together to create experience. And through knowing this, we can transform and enrich our lives and the lives of others. So this is very much on the sort of concluding notes of this work. So just bringing home these really important points. Yeah. Okay. All right. We're probably going to go a little bit over time. I hope that's okay. Let's see here. Traleg Kyabgon really points to how we don't need to go back to understand why we have certain propensities. How we don't need to go back to understand why we need certain propensities, just to keep applying the remedies. Yeah, I would say, okay, this is the difference between view and practice. So of course, in practice, it's about applying the remedy, but we're motivated we're motivated to practice through understanding the like cause and effect. Yeah. Just to keep applying, my question is about past lives and how masters often remember their past lives with accomplishment. If we don't need to go back and move forward, what role does this play in our understanding of this study? Actually, not very much. The Tibetans are very unsentimental about past lives. They just say, well, past lives is what brought you here. And, big deal. Now it's about what's happening right now. Sometimes in the narratives of great masters, we talk about their different lives and celebrate, the wondrous things they've done and so forth. And you also have that in the Jataka tales in the sutras. So that's universal all across Buddhism, but it's more about understanding cause and effect. And so that actually practically plays into also what we're doing right now in terms of understanding how we're presently creating the conditions for our future lives. Yeah. Yeah, Buddhists seem to speculate a lot about past lives and centering our current circumstances around that. Yeah, no, they don't. It might sound like that to outsiders because in Buddhism we talk about past lives, but actually the practice itself is very sort of, there's concern for what is going to happen with us next, just like you might be concerned for your children having a good education for what happens when they grow up. And similarly also then in the Buddhist teaching we're concerned about future lives, but other than that there's very little interest really in past lives, like I say, except when we're celebrating the life of some great master, but that's not really about speculating or anything. All the time it comes back to this, and we've had this many times in terms of studying karma, where we say, if you want to know what you did in the past, well, just look at your present situation. That's it. If you want to know what your future will be like, look at your present actions. So again, we're just talking about cause and effect, and that's Traleg Kyabgon's point here. Okay, good. In the case of meeting with another's intensely negative emotions, where one's own positive emotions are difficult as a response, is the best we can do to wish the other well as we try and retreat from their apparent relentless chipping away at one? Well, yes, we have to do that because anything else is not going to work. So it's not really that we ultimately retreat. We don't cut them out of our life, but there might just be a time when if we can't help, and if our actions are going to be affected by our own reactive patterns, then it might just be good for us to just it doesn't even have to be physically retreating, but just take a deep breath and sort of find a place inside where we can begin to work with cultivating some sympathy, patience, generosity, all of these things. We're going to have to I think of yes, we can mark some boundary, but it's more about ourselves and our sort of inner working with ourselves. But nobody's saying this is easy. Again, like I always think of, we can learn martial arts in theory, but it's only going to be really helpful if we're practicing it. So, as you could say, in general, these things are not easy. So there's no sort of like, oh yeah, this is just how I do it. No, it actually requires a lot of work, and that's why this is why we we practice meditation. This is why we have a discipline around these things, that really the Buddhist path stands out in compared to many other systems of therapy or working with the mind, in that there's so much emphasis on the discipline of lifestyle and meditation. For those very reasons, that there's a humble recognition that it's not easy. But anyway, yeah, so understanding how the elements of mind work together to create experience. Chapter 16, how things exist and how things appear. So again, what we've talked about here is it's essential we understand how everything is interconnected, dependent arising. This is how we should understand the mind. And it's also through that then that we're able to construct strengths and qualities, that we can weaken negative habits, develop good habits, and also develop abilities and enlightened abilities. So the way that we are is due to habitual perceptions and the way that we then, on the basis of the way that we project and see things, then we respond in a particular way. This we also looked at last time, how it's essentially our particular imprints and our particular disposition that colors and creates how we see things and perceive things. So these actions shape us now and the continuity of our character. So when we respond, this is then what becomes part of us. Who we are and how we respond is, however, not predetermined. And that's an important point, especially nowadays, where very often we are sort of led to believe that we can't do differently because, you know, the chemicals of our brain and so on. But and also we could misunderstand karma in the sense that, oh yeah, well, this is just how I am. And there's the more that we can free ourselves from these habitual patterns, the more we have what we could call free will, or that we can see how there's absolutely there's no predetermination about how we should be behaving or how we're destined to behave. So it's about circumstances, how we handle circumstances. There's nothing predestined, predetermined. Traleg says, at the basis of this whole discussion, in the connection between emotional states, strength, and depth of character, and between virtue and vice that leads to the kinds of actions we perform, at the basis of this whole discussion is the connection, between emotional states, strength, and depth of character, and between the virtue and vice that leads to the kinds of actions we perform. So this is the understanding then that we bring to this. Traleg continues, Buddhism does not encourage viewing virtues and vices in purely moralistic terms. In the Buddhist context, virtues and vices do not refer to the need for us to follow rules or do what is considered to be the right thing. Rather, our virtues and vices should be understood as opportunities to choose actions that bring wholesome mental states and well-beings to ourselves and others. Yeah? Always deep breath always helps. In Denmark we say count to 10. Yeah. Random question about rebirth. Okay, we'll be going over time, people, but that's it's okay. This is our last evening. Hey, let's not stress. Let's take it easy. Might sort of go a little bit over time. Random question about rebirth. Assuming that a person is reborn as soon as possible after death, does the rebirth take place in the linear timeline? For example, if someone dies today, they will be reborn after today in our relative truth of time and calendar year. Yeah, that continues. Yeah, it's not as if we're going to be reborn in a different time dimension in the sense that we could be reborn in like the 18th century or something like that. We will, on the basis of causes and conditions, we will be continuing that, you could say, that experience of time and space. So that continues. Yeah. Of course, by the way, what applies here also is that, of course, time is experienced in different ways. So, of course, that's a whole different thing. That's the perception of time. But the progression of time on the basis of cause and effect continues. Yeah. So, again, some final advice here from Traleg Kyabgon. We should create the causes for happiness, for enjoying our life. And in doing so, this will affect our character and we will act in beneficial ways. Our emotions will be positive and nurturing rather than disturbing. So overall, when we're creating happiness, we're also creating less obscuration. We shouldn't think, oh, happiness, that's unrelated to enlightenment. The more happiness there is, genuine happiness, the more enlightenment there is, because real genuine happiness is less self-centering, less fixation. So with that also, there comes more insight. So they're very much tied up, happiness, temporary happiness, and ultimate enlightenment. We will not be helped by fixes that don't attend to transforming our character. So we might sort of be in a really grumpy mood, and it might help to switch on Netflix and have some sort of a momentary relief, but it doesn't actually change our character. It might relax us a bit, good thing, but the work still remains to be done. So anyway, virtue and vice in Buddhism is different from the Christian notion of sin. And sort of in general, sort of this idea that there is an ultimate right thing to do, an ultimate bad thing, doesn't really exist in terms of, there are prescribed in a particular way. It's really just, again, it's not about it's not, when we say good food and bad foods, we're not talking about, we're just talking about what actually helps our body. So, and similarly also, what helps our happiness. This is not about us being judged from the outside. It's about us simply being at the basis of us being constructed through cause and effect. So our being is constructed by what we do. What we do has an impact. These virtues and vices, they have an impact. So we do talk about, we have language for that. Some people, they're upset that some of the translators would use words that sort of have, how do you say, Christian connotations, like the word sin, we need to, I mean, sometimes it can be skillful to avoid using that, but sometimes also it ends up being too bland if we sort of try to sort of weed out all the different words that refer to the conditions for happiness, because that has traditionally been tied up with religion. So until we develop new words, then we might have to use some of the old religious vocabulary. Yeah. Of course, translators are trying to do what they can, but please be patient when they have to resort to what some people perceive as archaic terms. That happens. We can't get upset every time we come across that. Anyway, I'm just talking as a how do you say, on behalf of the Translators Guild. I'm sort of making a case here, Anyway, Traleg Kyabgon says, when we talk about psychological and emotional states, we are talking about a state of being. When we talk about virtues, vices, and an ethical way of being, we're referring to action. There has to be coordination between being and doing, yet often there is no coordination. This is very interesting. This is again like the difference between behavior and what lies behind. Behind our behavior is being. And so very often there's sort of we just think, oh, I should just behave in a particular way, but without the being aspect being properly in place. Okay. We need to distinguish between how things appear and how they are. This is what we're doing. This is the biggie in the Buddhist path. We don't want to be deceived. Things appear in a particular way that's not necessarily how they actually are. We get things wrong. We attribute and label phenomena in a way that they appear to be solid in one particular way, and they aren't. This is where we need wisdom, analysis, investigation that goes in and sees what are things actually. And that's where we begin to see that things are not the way that they appear. They're not solidly in a particular way. So we have our conventional experience of reality. This is relative truth. I see the world my way, and you're going to see the world your way. It's true for me. Right now, my lamp is to my left. If there was somebody in front of me, they would see it to my right. That's relative truth. We all see things differently, but it doesn't make it less true. It's true for us. So that's what we call relative truth. That's conventional truth. Can't be denied that this lamp is to my left. So the absence of the lamp actually existing in some absolute left or right, that is what we call absolute truth. So that's where we also begin to see that although things appear in a particular way, they don't necessarily exist ultimately in that particular way. And that's where the sage understands how things exist according to the perception of sentient beings, what they go through. The Buddha empathizes with sentient beings, but also understands what is the reality. And that's where the Buddha would like to teach us to operate within our world skillfully, according to relative truth, and also really understand what the nature of reality is, absolute truth. So we experience things, and yet in absolute reality, there is no self. Self is an interconnected phenomenon. We have these elements of the mind, the skandhas, and so on. In our conventional reality, we might fail to see how our perceptions are shaped by our emotions. And this is where we could benefit a lot with the degree to which we have understanding of absolute truth. To that extent also, we have ability to work successfully within our relative truth. And that's where we begin to unite the way things are with the way that things appear. So the thing is, we might believe our perceptions of things as truly existing in a certain way, and that's our problem. Now, Traleg says, in Mahayana, how things are is emptiness, which means lacking inherent existence, being insubstantial, and having the nature of shunyata. This is the dividing line between Buddhas and sentient beings, is whether or not we understand that, we see that. This is where we can be deceived, or we can have insight. On the basis of how things appear, then we ordinary persons, we have likes and dislikes. And we sometimes turn these into absolutes. That is good, that is bad. The appearance of things is based on the dharmas, meaning all the various mental factors. So our perception is something that's constructed on the basis of my previous experience and my particular inclinations and so on. I see things in particular ways, whether it's foods or people or objects, whatever it might be. If we could free ourselves from our distortion of reality, we would not be afflicted by emotions. So right now with emotions, we actually filter off how things are. But if we'd let go of these emotions, we'd actually begin to see more. We begin to actually be able to see things as they are. So the degree to which we can free ourselves from our projections, we'll be able to see more. We'll be not afflicted by our emotions. So this insight, seeing emptiness, shunyata, does not mean we should disregard our relationship with the world. In fact, this is about improving our relationship with the world. We need to see, however, the unity of how things are and how they appear. And that's the degree to which we could introduce this understanding that we shouldn't be deceived when we have particular perceptions of things that are our particular optics. We shouldn't be deceived in that sense. And that is where we begin to unify how things are and how they appear. So ordinarily, we fail to do this. We tend to think that things exist the way that they appear. And this is what drives our conflicting emotions. So Traleg says, we tend to think that how things appear is how things exist. As long as we think in that way, conflicting emotions will arise because of our assumption that what we perceive or how we experience things is real and solid. So the remedy here is actually what we're doing with all the path is this non-violence, to begin to actually settle, not impose our view on others, to practice calming the mind, analyzing, basically seeing clearly, trying to see straight. We can't rely on our personal insight from meditation. We need to understand the actual nature of reality. So we might, on the basis of our sort of emotional kind of spirituality, begin to have a particular feeling, and that's all very good, but it's not really that's not what we call the view. And we actually need to understand this truth of emptiness, that things, despite what we might feel about things and so on, we actually need to see the absence of inherent existence in any given phenomena. That's why Buddhism goes a bit further than just sort of being calm and friendly. We actually really want to see from the start, to know, is there really anything about things? And that's where sometimes it's a bit confusing if we come to Buddhism and just want to sort of feel good. And then the teacher says, look at how the reality is. And we're like, well, I'm not supposed to look at reality. Well, how do I feel about reality? No, the teacher's not interested in how we feel about reality. We'll feel about reality in all sorts of ways. The teacher would like us to see how things actually they exist independently of our projections on them. And that's what we'd want to understand when we're practicing meditation, so that we're not prone to fall for the deception of our mind. Yeah. So we may read about emptiness, but we need to understand how this relates to our experience of the world. And that's where we need to have this maturity that is not deceived, and this insight into how things are. And that's then where meditation is very helpful. Then we actually know what it is we're doing with our meditation. Whatever instruction and advice has come from the Buddha and enlightened practitioners such as Nagarjuna and Shantideva on the Indian side, and Longchenpa and Kamaparanjam Dorje on the Tibetan side, is informed guidance that we need to look closely at to a large degree. We need to take seriously what they have to say regarding enlightenment and the path. If we're unable to take this kind of instruction, advice with careful attention and follow it with vigor, it will impede our progress and capacity to understand what Buddhism speaks about in relation to ultimate reality. So unless we actually know what we're doing, we're going to be tripped up by our own sort of like confused ideas about the path. And also we might hear things like, the absolute nature is unchanging. When you think, oh yeah, well, it doesn't matter, I can do whatever I want, the absolute nature is unchanging. So it's so important that we actually educate ourselves and really understand what it is that we're doing, on the path to enlightenment. So we recognize that our insight fails to give us the full picture. So this is, of course, uninvestigated when we're just following our habitual projections. And that's where we need to join the advice from the Buddhas with our experience. So when we hear about the teachings on discerning the nature of reality, then we need to check it out and align this with our own personal experience. So we can trust the Buddha. We might have reason to trust the Buddha. We could give the Buddha the benefit of the doubt. But then again, if there's something we don't understand, we need to look at it, verify it, and make sure that we actually really know what's being talked about. We can feel it, experience it. So blind faith in the authority of the Buddha might be useful at some stage. So of course, initially when we come to the teaching, then there's some advice given, and the guru will say particular things and so on. That can be very helpful. We might just follow that, and we'll say, well, Rinpoche says this, and the Buddha says this, and so on. But it's when we begin to actually use our own logic, use our own experience, that we begin to really see the wisdom of this. And that brings us further trust in the path. That's where we really become enthusiastic about the path. So there's three ways then in terms of applying this kind of insight, prajna, we can call it, wisdom or intelligence. In the ways that we can deal with the emotional state is that we can first of all see how everything is made up of conditions, elements, that's the interconnected nature of things, that the way that we perceive things is our particular relative perception, And also we can understand that phenomena objectively, they lack any kind of reality. They don't actually exist in a particular way. And for that reason also, what appears to be in one particular way can be transformed. For example, we might find out that we're late, we just missed our train, and we'll say, oh, this is terrible. But then if we see, well, it's only that we missed the train is only bad from the particular point of view that, we would have liked to have been somewhere else at a particular time, then again, it might actually be a great time for us to just sit down and breathe and meditate or study or do something, take a walk in the park. So that's where we understand that having missed the train is not an absolute bad. It depends how we see it. And because it lacks an inherent existence, we can transform this. Traleg Kyabgon says, that is, one is trying to have an understanding of what Buddha has said to help relate to what is going on when we are feeling a sense of confusion and bewilderment. These contemplations and considerations give us background information we need to clarify what is happening in the mind. Using this background information helps us identify how and where we have lost perspective. Basically, again, what we call understanding the view. Having the view, then we can understand our circumstances better. For example, in the case of being hurt, we can go deeper and see the complexity of our experience. So if there's somebody who does something, we're upset with them, we can see, well, I'm a bit sensitive because of my conditions. These people, they do this because of their particular dispositions and so forth. So we see the complexity of this thing that we call hurt. So if without such examination, just looking at the end product, we miss the insight. I feel hurt. It's bad. I'm upset. Then that's just the end product. And we lack actually the understanding of the causes that create this, and we lack the complexity and the wider perspective. So in doing that, without that examination, we miss the dependent nature and and we miss seeing the insubstantiality of our experience, like missing the train or this experience of being hurt. If we apply the holistic approach of the three above, we see the essencelessness. The three above were those that we say, seeing the interconnected nature of things, the relative nature of our experience, and that phenomena lack reality and can be transformed. Traleg Kyabgon says we can see the experiences arise in relation to varieties of factors, hence the complexity. If our anger, jealousy, and so forth had an essence, there would be no complexity. It would then be very simple. The fact that there are not simple on the level of appearance and the varieties of ways we experience that appearance shows that there is no essence. So if anger and all these various emotions had an essence, then there would never ever be any kind of cause, or there would never be any kind of change. There would be this solidity of anger, and it would also be indestructible. It would be forever there, but it's not. It's due to come into some condition of appearance and experience due to causes and conditions, and it will dissipate again due to causes and conditions. So when we talk about particularly emotions like jealousy, there can be many kinds. So there can be jealousy in terms of, like Traleg Kyabgon just gives the example of our career, or being bypassed, or there can be jealousy of other kinds, our loved ones, it's preferring the company of others, etc., etc. There's many kinds of jealousy. The neighbor is a better meditator, that kind of thing. So when we begin to understand that these kind of apparently solid experiences, they are not so real, then we have a greater spaciousness. And when we have that, then we also not overcome by us reacting quickly and habitually. And that's why we need this wider perspective. Vipassana is actually the wisdom that sees the interconnected nature of our experiences. So that's seeing dependent arising. And once we have that, then to integrate the perspectives of how things appear and how they are. So once we begin to see the interconnected nature of our perceptions, our world, the people around us, and so on, we see them as being, made up of various causes and conditions. We don't react with this sort of like way of excluding the various perspectives. We just go according to our particular agenda and so on. When we have that open-mindedness, then we also begin to see that the things appear in a particular way, but they're also free of inherent existence. So that's where we see the integration of how things appear and how they are. Traleg says one needs to develop the understanding that there is no separation between the appearance and how we experience the appearance and its insubstantial essence. If there were essence or substantiality, then appearance would be consistent. For example, there would be one essential unchanging state called anger, and then we would be able to say with certainty, this is anger. Or we could say, this is jealousy, this is hatred. But as we know, it does not happen this way. These perceptions, these experiences, and so on, they come and go. They're entirely constructed. And the more I walk this path, the more I become aware of how self-centered I am. And it's quite frustrating because I see that this human experience is so deeply buried in an infinite delusion that sometimes it's hard to hope. How do we deal with this frustration? Well, practice of the path. This is we might think that, oh, I am so deluded, but we're not. It's just we haven't looked. So, there's not, we hadn't looked and now we're looking. It's okay. This can be worked with. There's a very, very positive angle in this situation is that this can be worked with. So, we're presently confused, but there's nothing that will prevent us from being less confused. We just work with the path. That's exactly why the Buddha taught. And this situation of samsara is deeply, deeply concerning. And that's why the path it's important. And it's not just about us, but it's about others. We're maybe caught up in a delusion, but others too. So our path and our practice should really be motivated with the sympathy for others. So this teaching on this chapter on interdependence and the two truths should be taught in schools since grade 1, all the way till university. Especially should be a main teaching in all modern psychology studies. That's right. That's right. I was just talking with a friend of mine. He's from Argentina, and he teaches compassion and altruism in Spain. I think he's moving back to Argentina, but he works with this center that essentially teaches this in a secular context. And of course, the objective of this is something that comes actually from Stanford University over in the States. The implication is that this should, of course, become standard in the curriculum in schools. So the more we sort of engage this conversation with the world, the more actually the value and the truth of this will be communicated. So, if we begin to understand this, we apply it, then also it more and more will translate into social action, if you like. Understanding how everything appears in relationship, we renounce unrealistic beliefs. So we have habitual ways of seeing good, bad, when we see things really just exist on the basis of our perceptions. We renounce these kind of unfounded beliefs. So this brings about emotional well-being and other human capacities. The more we do that, the more qualities will evolve. Understanding this interrelationship, interdependent origination, we will experience an open world of vivid emotional color. The thing is, we begin to actually open our mind. When we see relationship, when we see interdependence, we begin to see much more. But there's something that needs to be done. We need to manage and moderate our responses. Yeah, the way that we habitually react is not going to work. So fixating, when we do to that, when we hold on to things, my way of seeing things, then also there's my wants and my sort of agenda and so on. It's endless. So what we refer to in Buddhism is much more than what we call referred to as renunciation. It's much more about like just turning our back to the world, marching off to the hills. It has to do about letting go of habitual responses to the world of the world that we live in, our perceptions. Traleg Kyabgon says renunciation is not an approach to looking at everything in the world as being insignificant, totally distracting, vile, or something to get rid of or to escape from. This is not the Buddhist view. The Buddhist view is that we should escape from what we should escape from is the world of make-believe that is based on our exaggerated expectations and frustrations. This means that we should renounce our expectation that the world can deliver more than it can, since this is how the samsaric state is perpetuated. So as long as we're in samsara, we shouldn't expect actually happiness. But then again, if we can extract ourselves from this delusion, then genuine happiness can take place. But real happiness is not going to take place on the premise of our habitual samsaric way of seeing things. So the point is, what we're attempting to do, what we do in the Mahayana, what we're doing as bodhisattvas, is to deal with the world with an insight into how things are. And this means we don't get worked up. The bodhisattvas are chilled. They are seeing things how they are. They are aware of how they appear, but they also not lose sight of how things are. So that means that we're not talking about emptiness as meaning that there's nothing there. Emptiness just means that things are not stuck in one particular way. And the moment that we understand the unity of how things appear and how things are, when we can see these two things together, that things appear in a particular way, but they also don't exist the way that we're perceiving them, that they're free from any identity that we might impute on them, then this opens up for a much wider perspective. It opens us up to the world. It opens us, we become much more cosmopolitan, much more sophisticated, much more in tune with our reality. So the Bodhisattva responds with a sensibility that goes beyond linear logic and rationality, meaning also the Bodhisattva has much more heart. There's much more empathy. There's an understanding that goes just beyond just sort of the math of understanding lack of inherent existence. There's a tremendous sense of warmth and empathy that comes with this liberation. So having such a heart, the Bodhisattva might be deeply caring about others, but it doesn't mean that they're entirely caught up in their emotions. They also have wisdom. So as much as they care for the world, they also understand the confusion that drives the world. So in the Mahayana, we proceed from the intelligence of prajna to the wisdom of jhana. So we work with prajna that understands, but then eventually the notion of someone who understands something falls away, and then we are wisdom. So that's more what we call jhana or jnana. Traleg Kyabgon says it's important to ensure we do not get cut off from our emotions or desensitize ourselves. Equally important is to not become completely emotional and lose our capacity to think clearly and reason through things. We need both capacities. Both are essential. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Good. We're all in agreement here. That's good. So we can work with our minds, and we work with loving kindness. Actually, Traleg Kyabgon here is referring to Lojong practice. Yeah. So meditating on loving kindness, we can do that because we might think of ourselves as not being particularly loving, not particularly kind, but we can change. And so in doing so, we can address the different aspects of our mind one by one. We can start off just generating a little bit of sympathy for one person, and we can extend that. So working with generosity, we can be aware of our tendencies such as impatience. So if we work on one aspect, we can at the same time also be aware that we have a bit of impatience, you know. So these kind of things, one by one, they also naturally just involve then working with other shortcomings. So the bottom line is that we understand that we can change. We might think, oh, I'm stuck in being this way. And that's such a depressing and profoundly flawed, mistaken, delusional assumption. So we can change. Actually, we can't help changing, but we need to recognize that. And that's what plants a positive seed. Traleg Kyabgon says, so we work on whichever characteristics or propensities in our character we feel need more immediate attention. In that way, we can experience real progress. The desire to improve is a very positive motivation and is enough to begin the process of change. The Mahayana view is that it makes sense to think about the power of thought in conjunction with what we would like to change within ourselves, but often we do not see the beginnings of change and happening so easily. If we recognize the power of thoughts to instigate change, then change is closer and the process of change less daunting than we may think. So we might think that, oh, we're stuck in a particular way, we're stuck in a particular situation, and we know that it will, but rather we then are overwhelmed by the presence of what's undesirable in a situation. And that's why it's very helpful if we know that it's going to change, it's going to pass. So the Mahayana has very skillful ways to integrate our thoughts so they work for change. Lojong practice. We can transform our aversions, attachments, and different attitudes, and we do that in terms of how we dislike or we like and we don't care. And that's not just about the people around us, but also anybody. So the sage is equally caring for everyone and is free from these process of censorship or filtering where we like some, we don't like others, and so on. So Traleg Kyabgon makes the point, in the Mahayana, we seek to love both enemies and friends. The thing is, we are in relationship with the world. So in the Dharma, we have a wealth of methods to diffuse and repair our emotional states. As you probably realized at this point, but there's many, many, many. So everything in the Dharma is about relieving this pressure that we're experiencing. We have various kinds of emotional states, many of which are destructive. And so we want to be able to deal with these. So we transform them. We can transform them because they're transformable. So seeing the nature of appearances and reality can truly transform. They're transformable because they appear solid, but in reality they're not. So when we see how they're appearing to us and we work with that skillfully, you know, here's this person I don't like, but then when I begin to see this, what I don't like might have something to do with me, the way I perceive it might be due to conditions out there, then the appearances begins to be replaced by a perspective that has to do with reality, the nature of things not being the way we're seeing it. And that's where we can begin to transform things. And all of a sudden, the person we don't like, we can begin to say, oh, you know, there's probably something good about them. Oh, there actually is something good about them. Oh, what a wonderful person. So we can change. So we need a complete array of study and practice. So as all are interconnected, there's not a single of the Buddhist teachings that are not useful in one way or another. Traleg Kyabgon says, in Buddhism, there are many views and they are interconnected. The different aspects of the discussion presented here are not purely intellectual and abstract, but directly relate to our emotional well-being. In Buddhism, we're not wanting to be simply a rational person, but rather a sensible one. Sensible person is what one should try to learn to become. No aspect of the human condition can be left out on our spiritual journey. We use everything on the path to enlightenment. It is important to be fully engaged and to embrace what it is to be human. So I think the last lines of the book then says, the power of desire can uplift us and lead us to experience a fuller and greater sense of ourselves and to embrace humanity in our own humanness. Managing the complexity of being human, and through such management, achieving self-improvement and transformation is its own art form. Strength, resilience, and courage are all essential on the path. It can be said that perfection lies in our ability to have a connection with that which is not perfect. So this is the skillful means, that what appears not to be perfect is something that we can connect with, and it can actually enable us to see the unity of appearance and emptiness, and in there we can discover the purity of any given phenomena. So what appears to be not perfect is liberated into perfection. Point being, this unity of how things appear and how they actually are. But this is something that, of course, needs to be done in terms of our experience. And that's where what we're talking about here is not a philosophy, it's about a practice. So this is something that we are now encouraged. We take this book with us and we use it as our manual in terms of our experience. Okay. So then, thank you. There's someone making a prayer and saying this is wonderful work by Traleg Kyabgon, and it's wonderful that we could study this together. And then there's a toast. Here is to the extraordinary Traleg Kyabgon and the Dharma. May we continue to integrate these teachings for the sublime and lasting benefit of ourselves and others. Thank you. So someone says, appreciation for choosing this book. I'm going to keep it by me with a highlighter. Wonderful. That's good. Thank you. A great map for new journey in ourselves. Great. Good. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining me in this study. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to study this, attempt to study this deeper. So we've done this together. This is wonderful. And apologies to all the lineage masters, the lineage holders, the Dakas and Dakinis, in case of any, how do you say, shortcoming in properly representing Traleg Kyabgon's Vajra speech. And anyway, I hope this has brought everybody, or all of us here, to have a greater understanding and to meet with Traleg Kyabgon's wisdom mind. And like I said, tomorrow is the anniversary of Traleg Kyabgon, his passing. So this is then where students of Traleg Kyabgon, and also us who remember Traleg Kyabgon, even thinking of Traleg Kyabgon if we never met him, this is a good moment to then dwell on this recollection of him. So thank you. I'm just going to mention the next study that we'll be doing here online. This will be a work by Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, and this is Pure Appearance. This is actually what the last chapter here was about. This will actually begin with where this last chapter finished, because this pure appearance, pure perception is where we begin to eliminate our confused projection onto phenomena, the way they appear, and begin to see how things actually are. That's where we begin to engage this thing that we call pure appearance. So you could say there's a logical progression then to the next study, which will be then pure appearance. It will be from December 10 to October 15. And it's on the website. Yeah. And then someone actually has there's just a link here to, if you go on the Evam Institute website, evaminstitute.org, then there will be a Parinirvana celebration of Traleg Kyabgon Rinpoche. So Thank you very much for letting us know. Yeah, good. So there's an opportunity to join in the celebration there. Thank you. By this positive action, may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom, and attain the two supreme kayas which arise from merit and wisdom.